The previous chapter, chapter 10, described the table of nations as descended from the 3 sons of Noah. Chapter 11 now sees these people migrating east to the land of Shinar, a region of southern Mesopotamia, in which cities such as Babylon were founded. This is the region of the earliest civilization, the Sumerian. Here is the setting for the final universal judgment, the Tower of Babel. The inhabitants say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." In those days, cities were not places where people lived. They were administrative centres with a temple in the middle, surrounded by buildings for storage and enclosed by a wall. The only people who lived there would have been priests and public officials. The tower these people constructed was a ziggurat. Temples were imagined to have their roots in the underworld and their tops going into the heavens. There was a stairway for the gods to descend and ascend. There were no rooms in the ziggurat except at the top, where a bed and a table were set so that the god might refresh himself. The idea of the ziggurat is reflected in Jacob's vision later on in Genesis. Their plan was to reach into the heavens, but they are far short. God comes down to see what they are up to and introduces another limitation. The first was stopping humans from eating from the tree of life. The second was limiting their lifespan to 120 years. Now God thwarts their godless ambition by dispersing them in the confusion of language. An ancient Sumerian legend foresaw a time when all nations would speak their language. But Babylon, despite all its greatness in years to come, will become a symbol for evil, greed, and arrogant opposition to God. Following this judgment, the genealogy of Shem is now completed. Notice that the lifespans are starting to reduce. The limitation that God set in Genesis 6 is gradually being implemented. Here now ends the primeval history which had a universal scope. Now the focus narrows to the ancestor of Shem, and from the origins of all the nations to the origins of Israel. So at 11 verse 27 we begin what is known as the Abraham cycle. This is a series of stories about Abraham which last from here until chapter 25 verse 11. Chapter 12 begins with God calling Abram to leave his father's house and to go to a land that he will show him. This is a very significant command because while the father Terah was alive, and he does not die until 2 years before Sarai does, Abram belonged in his household and stood to inherit it. Leaving the household meant forfeiting all his inheritance. He leaves everything of value to an ancient person, his family and his land. It is an action of considerable trust in God, in fact total trust. God's promise to Abram is that he will make him a great nation, and all nations will either be blessed or cursed through him. As Abram travels in the new regions, he builds altars to the Lord, thus establishing the worship of him where it was not before. Now there is a less glorious episode for Abram. He takes his wife Sarai to Egypt because of a famine, and in order to protect himself, lies that he is her brother. This may be because a ruler might be willing to negotiate with a brother for marriage, but would prefer simply to kill a husband. Despite Adam's regrettable actions, the Lord's commitment to bless him results in their safe release, taking with them all the things that Pharaoh had given to Abram on account of Sarai. Pharaoh suffers plagues because of her, which both reflect the blessings and curses that revolve around Abram, but also foreshadows what will happen when Moses comes to rescue Israel. Chapter 11 began with the story of the Tower of Babel, a story of universal judgment. But Abraham sets out from Ur, which is south of this region, and begins the story of universal redemption.